Good afternoon. This is George Yates, and I'm here with Justice for All. Hope you're enjoying your afternoon. I've got a really exciting show that we're going to have today. My guest, and I'm so thrilled to have this guest here. He's calling us from London, and his name is Bill Browder. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago and the Stanford Business School. His grandfather was the presidential candidate from the Communist Party. And Mr. Browder decided that he was going to become a capitalist when he was growing up as opposed to the rest of his family. And he took his career in capitalism to London, and he ended up working in investing in the Soviet Union just after the fall of the Russian Federation, I would say, or the Soviet Union, and became one of the most successful investors in it was the largest foreign investor in the Russia that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth. The name of his book is Red Notice: A True Story of High Finance, Murder, and One Man's Fight for Justice. And we're so thrilled to have him today. How you doing, Mr. Browder?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much.
Well, you're calling us from London. Are you still at the helm of the Hermitage Fund?
Well, so I for most of my career I was running the Hermitage Fund, but as we're going to discuss today, my experience in Russia got veered very far off track by some criminal activities of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin when they murdered my young lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, and so I've gone from being a hedge fund manager to a human rights activist, and that's what I do today.
Wow, that's quite a change. And your history as when you read your book, it's a fascinating read, and it's called Red Notice. And what is a red notice?
A red notice is an arrest warrant issued by Interpol, in which they use to try to catch international fugitives. And in my case, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government have tried on 3 occasions to issue a red notice for me after I successfully fought for justice for my murdered lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, which led to a law being passed in Washington imposing sanctions on Russian human rights violators. And so for a number of periods of time, the Russian government has been after me trying to issue a red notice, which is the name of my book.
And the red notice arrest warrant for you was based upon you were actually convicted in a Russian court in absentia when you weren't even in Russia. Isn't that a fact? And what were you convicted of?
Well, this is the most remarkable thing. So after this U.S. sanctions law was passed at the end of 2012, and it was passed in the name of my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, Vladimir Putin got so angry that he decided to put us both on trial, Sergei Magnitsky and myself. And let me just repeat this. Sergei Magnitsky, my murdered lawyer, he was dead for 3 years at the hands of the Russian government, and they put him on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. Not even Stalin did that. And they put me on trial as his co-defendant and in absentia. And they had a full courtroom with a judge, with prosecutors, with defense attorneys, with court reporters, with bailiffs, with guards, with the press corps, and there was only 2 empty seats in the cage in the courtroom, and that was the seat for myself, and that was the seat for my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. And at the end of the trial, which lasted several months, they found us both guilty. They couldn't do much with Sergei because they already killed him, but they sentenced me to 9 years in absentia, where the conviction still stands in Russia.
What was it that you did in Russia, and what was it that Magnitsky did in Russia that so angered the Putin government that they would throw you out of the country when at one time you were the most successful and largest foreign investor in Russia? Magnitsky was a well-respected, honorable, and ethical tax attorney in Russia. What was it that you did that made Putin so angry that he would have Magnitsky murdered and you thrown out of the country and convicted in this kangaroo court?
Well, it all started when as my investment fund, I had this investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, and as it grew to become really large, and I eventually became the largest investment fund in the country with $4.5 billion under management. I discovered corruption, large-scale, massive corruption in the companies that I was investing in, and these were big companies that you've probably heard of, called like Gazprom and the National Savings Bank and the National Electricity Company. And I felt a responsibility to try to stop the corruption from happening. And the one tool that I had available to me was my research skills, how to research how they did the corruption. And myself and my team would do forensic investigations into corruption, and then we would expose these investigations through the Wall Street Journal, through the New York Times, the Financial Times, Washington Post, and these exposés obviously upset the people who were the beneficiaries of the corruption. And after doing this for a number of years and doing it quite successfully, I eventually stepped on the wrong toes. And in November 13th, 2005, as I was flying back from a trip abroad back into Moscow, where I had been living for 10 years, I was stopped at Sheremetyevo Airport, and I was grabbed out of the VIP lounge, and I was put into the detention center of the airport, kept there for almost a day, and then deported back to London and declared a threat to national security. And that was just the beginning of my troubles. After that, I evacuated my staff. I got all of our money, all of the fund's money out of the country. And then my offices were raided by the police. 25 police officers raided the office, and 25 more officers raided the office of my American law firm that I was using out there. And they seized all of our documents during this raid. And that was the point when I got Sergei Magnitsky involved to investigate what was going on. And Sergei was a 35-year-old lawyer. He worked for an American law firm out there. He was the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia. He was one of these people who could do 10 things in the time that it took others to do one. And I had him investigate to try to figure out why they were raiding the office and what was going to happen next. And he did this big investigation, and he discovered that the purpose of the raid was twofold. One, to try to steal all of our money, but thankfully we got it out of the country in time. But two, and this is the most cynical thing that he and I had ever witnessed, was that they didn't try just to steal our money, but they also, through a complicated scheme, stole $230 million of taxes that we paid from the Russian government. We paid this money to the Russian government the previous year, and using the documents seized from our companies, they stole our companies, and then they applied for a $230 million tax refund, which was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. And they applied for it on December 23rd, 2007, 2 days before Christmas, and it was approved and paid out the very next day. And that discovery, that expose, was what ultimately led to Sergei being arrested, tortured, and killed in a Russian prison by the people who had orchestrated that crime.
Who killed Magnitsky?
Well, it's a lot of people who killed Magnitsky. So basically what happened was he discovered this crime. He testified against the people who had raided the office and seized the documents. Those people then arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then subsequently, while he was in pretrial detention, his jailers started to torture him. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds, and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up and the stench would be unbearable. They would move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night.
Was this at?
Did
Putin
have all this
anything
to
do
try to
with
get
this?
him to retract his accusations against the police officers, and they wanted him to sign a false confession saying that he had stolen the $230 million, the $230 million, the money that he had exposed them for stealing, and he just absolutely refused to perjure himself. He was a man of incredible principle and integrity, and he refused to perjure himself. And so while all this was going on, his health completely broke down. He lost 40 pounds. He developed terrible pains in his stomach, and he was diagnosed with having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. And about a week before the operation, instead of allowing him to be operated on, they abruptly moved him from a prison that had a medical facility to a prison called Butyrka, which is a maximum security prison, several hundred years old facility, considered to be one of the most awful, toughest places in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, Butyrka had no medical facilities that could deal with his ailments. And they moved him there, and then they completely sort of abandoned him to his disease. And he went into absolute downward health spiral. He had constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain. And they refused him medical treatment, refused him any kind of pain relief, anything. He and his lawyers applied for medical attention in writing to every different branch of the judicial, penal, and law enforcement systems in Russia, and every single one of their requests was either ignored or denied. And finally, his body could no longer handle it. And on the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei went into critical condition. And on that night, the Butyrka prison authorities decided they didn't want to have responsibility for him, so they put him in an ambulance to a different prison across town that had a medical wing. But when the ambulance arrived, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell, chained him to a bed, and then 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he was found about an hour and 18 minutes later by a civilian doctor dead on the floor. And so, who killed him? Well, that's the whole story. A lot of people played a role.
Well, do you put the ultimate murder of Magnitsky responsibility with Vladimir Putin?
Well, the Vladimir Putin's role wasn't so much in the murder. I'm sure he knew nothing about it because there's literally tens of thousands of these cases going on in Russia all the time. He doesn't have time to pay attention to all this stuff. But I'll tell you what his role was after Sergei was killed, it became my single overriding life mission to make sure that he gets justice, that the people who did this don't get away with it. And as I launched the campaign for justice for Sergei, Putin started to get involved in what can only be described as a major cover-up of a murder. And so Putin's crime in the Magnitsky case is personally getting involved in the obstruction of justice in a murder. And I'll tell you how he did it, and it's really remarkable. So, first of all, the first thing I should say is that the reason this case is so unique is that Sergei wrote down everything that happened to him while he was in jail. He wrote 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention, documenting exactly who did what to him, when, how, where, why, and because of that, we have the most well-documented trail of evidence of human rights abuse that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. It's like the modern-day Gulag archipelago, and so we expected that there would be some type of justice inside of Russia on the back of that, but no, the authorities completely and absolutely all the way up the chain of command launched into a cover-up. They changed the cause of death. They changed the time of death. They said that there was no signs of violence, even though anyone who's seen any pictures of his body can see bruises from the beating. They changed they claimed that he had never applied for medical attention, even though there's just all sorts of requests in writing that they even rejected. And then they exonerated every single person involved. And then on top of that, on the 1-year anniversary of his death, the Russian government gave promotions to 5 people who were intimately involved in one aspect or another of this case. And so it became clear that there was no chance of getting justice inside of Russia. And so we sought justice outside of Russia. And and the justice that we figured out we could get was that the people who did this, they didn't do this for any kind of ideology. They did it for money. They killed Sergei Magnitsky in order to cover up the theft of $230 million.
But why do you need to worry about that when you've got a Russia like Putin's Russia, where there's theft and corruption? And I'm not saying I agree with you. I believe you. But isn't it a fact that there's just this sort of theft and corruption all over Russia? I mean, that's all you hear about with Putin's Russia, is that it's nothing but a mafia type criminal, enterprise with Putin at the top and these 22 or so oligarchs that control everything in the country, and they're just theft and corruption everywhere. And why would we need to go kill Magnitsky when they can do whatever they want anyway? Why was it necessary?
It's a good question, and the answer is that they like to sort of wrap these things up very neatly into little bows and then put them away, and it goes all the way back to the Stalin period. You remember, in the Stalin period, they always tortured people into confessions before they executed them. They sort of like to have these these legal neat procedures, in order to, and it's just their own way that they don't want to, they don't ever want to leave these things sort of open. And so they wanted to have they wanted to blame him for their crime. They wanted to that was what they wanted to do, and it didn't work out the way they wanted, and they had to kill him.
They want to have. It sounds like even though corruption and theft is the norm, they always want to have some sort of appearance that it's all fair and just. So that's why they get the confession, then they kill the guy, and then there's deniability that there was ever a theft in the first place, and then we'll have this court proceeding where we try a dead person and a guy that's outside of the country so that we can tie it up neatly and say these guys all got convicted and everything that we're doing. So I guess this is to assuage the masses, right, that everything is above board.
Well, it may not even be for their own masses. I think it's for Western consumption. They want to be able to sort of, they want to be able to look President Obama in the eye and say, all this stuff that everyone's talking about, that's just nonsense. Sergei Magnitsky was a crook. Bill Browder, his advocate, is a crook, and so on and so forth. That's what they want to say, and so they don't have. But coming back to our justice campaign, because this is really important, we figured out that no matter how crooked these guys are in Russia, no matter how crooked the system is in Russia, they don't like to keep their own money in Russia. They steal this money, but they're afraid to keep it in Russia for the same reason that it was so easy to steal. It could be stolen from them. And so I came up with an idea, which was that, okay, we can't prosecute these people necessarily in America or England for murder that took place in Russia, but we sure as heck can make sure they don't travel to America or England, and not to let them spend their money here. And so I came up with this idea to impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And I took this idea to Washington in the spring of 2010. And I first approached a Democrat senator from Maryland named Benjamin Cardin and told him the story. And then I approached a very famous Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain. And they were both equally appalled by what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. And they were both equally exercised to want to do something within their powers as lawmakers. And I suggested this idea of visa sanctions and asset freezes. And they both grabbed onto it on a bipartisan basis and came up with a law called the Magnitsky Law. And the Magnitsky Law first started out as a law just for Sergei Magnitsky, basically to punish the people who were involved in the crimes against him. And then something very interesting happened, which was that the very, very high-profile Russian opposition leaders started coming to Washington to say that, you've basically found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. And one of the most famous opposition politicians who came to Washington to say that was a man named Boris Nemtsov, whose name you might recognize. He was the opposition politician who was assassinated in front of the Kremlin.
He was just
27th
killed.
Of February.
Yeah, he was just killed last month, right? Wow.
And
I wonder who
I'm
killed
sure we'll
him.
talk about Boris Nemtsov later, and I'd like to, because his assassination is really an important subject. But
yes.
But just to carry on with the story, and so they said that this law should be, should apply to other people, not just to the people who killed Magnitsky, but to all the other terrible atrocities that are taking place in Russia. And it just made so much sense that these two senators added 65 words to the Magnitsky law to include all human rights abusers in Russia. And then this thing just snowballed into an unstoppable piece of legislation in the Senate and in the House. And it ended up getting voted on in November of 2012, 92-4 in the Senate and 89% of the House of Representatives. And President Obama, who, by the way, was not in favor of it at all. He didn't want to do anything to upset Putin, but he had really no choice. He signed it into law on the 14th of December 2012, the Magnitsky Act, named after my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. And there's now a piece of sanctions legislation, the first time in 35 years against Russia, named after my lawyer, which served as the template to sanction further Russian officials after the invasion of Crimea and Ukraine.
So it's ongoing. Are there adding now? Are there actually specific names on this list of people that are being sanctioned so that they go after their assets, won't let them travel, they can't get visas, their passports are no good coming into America and other Western countries? Exactly what does the Magnitsky Act do? What does it stop? What sort of teeth does it have, and who is affected by it?
Well, at the moment, there are 34 people on the Magnitsky list. It's a relatively short list. We want it to be much longer. And of those 34 people, roughly 30 of them were involved one way or another in the Magnitsky atrocity, and 4 of them are in other human rights cases. And what this law does is 3 things. It publicly names their names, so their name is on a federal register. It bans travel into the United States, and it freezes their assets and puts their name on a what's called the Treasury OFAC sanctions list. And for most people who don't know what that is, it is a list that basically says that no bank or U.S. corporation can do business with these people anywhere in the world. And if they do, then that bank or that corporation is in violation of U.S. sanctions. And this is the same list that Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists are on, and drug lords from Colombia and Mexico are on. And basically, these people become sort of persona non grata in the whole world. Once your name is on that list, you're kind of, a leper in the world of you can't get a bank account or anything. And so it certainly isn't justice for torture and murder, but what it is a very strong financial sanction, which definitely changes the lives of people who are on that list, and it terrifies everybody else whose names aren't on that list that there's something out there in the world that if they step too far and they do something too bad, that they may very well have their financial lives ruined. And it's better than total impunity, which is what existed before the law was passed. If you've just joined us, I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. And we've been speaking with Bill Browder. He's in London, and he's a human rights activist. But in his previous life, he was the largest foreign investor in Russia before being thrown out of the country in 2005. And then after he moved his assets out of the country, his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was tortured and murdered by the Russian, people acting on behalf of the Russian government. And Mr. Browder has spent the last years of his life, or last few years of his life, moving on from being a very successful hedge fund manager, the most successful hedge fund manager in Russia, to becoming a human rights advocate and fighting for this law. And it's the Magnitsky law, which imposes sanctions against
these Russians that are responsible for killing Sergei. What exactly, your book reads, it's a fascinating read, this book, Red Notice. It first of all, it chronicles your incredible career going up from being going from an MBA at Stanford to London to Russia, your quest to get seed money for your global fund, the way you got your first 25 million. You have incredible research skills, your ability to go and find out which of these Russian companies were undervalued, which they all were, invested in them, and you took this 25 million, you turned it into 4.5 billion. It's just an incredible story of your investing career, and then yet you somewhere along the way began to look at the thefts that you saw from these Russian companies. And as you say in your book, they don't teach you how to find out Russian theft in Stanford Business School. I'm going to start all over. And is that what got you thrown out of the country initially? You saw theft, you saw your companies being stolen right out from under you, apparently, while you were in Russia doing investments for people. And you began to investigate that, and then once you began to find out who was stealing from you, and you made it public in your own way by calling the Wall Street Journal, is that what got you thrown out of the country?
Exactly. So basically, there's just so much stealing that goes on in Russia, you can't even imagine it. And you know, I went there with great optimism and hope, and a lot of naivete, being sort of brought up in America that things were kind of, maybe they were crazy, but they were going to somehow normalize. And I discovered that it was just, the place was just criminal from top to bottom. And I felt, and I was managing a lot of money for my investors, invested in these companies, and there's just stealing going on left, right, and center. And I felt a responsibility to try to stop it. It just felt like I couldn't just sit there and own shares of these companies and watch everything getting stolen out right in front of me. And so I started to try to research how the stealing took place. We called it stealing analysis, and we would do this stealing analysis on the big companies in our portfolio, and then we would get this information, and it was quite remarkable. So the stuff we were discovering was just remarkable. I mean, just to give you an example, in Gazprom, which is the largest oil and gas company in the world, we discovered that between 1996 and 1999, the management of Gazprom, about 9 people, had stolen oil and gas reserves out of the company equal to the size of the oil and gas reserves of Kuwait. So, the Gulf War was fought over that, and we just discovered, and we were the first people to discover it, and we were able to prove it, that 9 individuals had stolen oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait out of Gazprom.
Wow.
And we proved it, and we publicized it. And it set off a chain reaction of events, which eventually got these guys fired, and a new guy came in to run the company, which then led to a huge appreciation of the share price. And I shouldn't be so nice to the new guy, because he was doing some bad stuff as well. But
what you did do is you actually the consensus among Western investors was that much more of Gazprom had already been stolen. And so once you determined that only 9% of it had been stolen, but most people thought that 99% of it had been stolen. So actually, you determined that Gazprom was much more valuable than people thought it was, right?
Yeah. Well, basically, So yeah, the shares are trading more than a 99% discount, and it turns out that even after stealing oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait, that only represented 9.65% of the reserves of the company.
Wow!
And so, in the investment world, which is what I was in, if you find something that's trading at a 99% discount, and you find out that more than 90% of it is still there, what do? You back up the truck and load it right up. And I made it my largest single investment in Russia. We then exposed all the stuff, and then the share price doubled and doubled and doubled again. In the end, between 1999 and 2005, the share price of Gazprom went up 100 times. 100 times.
Yeah, and you rode that wave and made a lot of money on that one deal. And I'll tell you, this book is fascinating. It's called Red Notice. I'm with Bill Browder. And there's a part in your book where you also, and this wasn't your Gazprom investment, it was an investment in another oil company, where the CEO tried to dilute your investors' shares in it, and you were not about to let that happen to you either, and you took them on, and your London partner said, "Bill, be careful. You're in Russia. They'll kill you." Next thing you know, you've got bodyguards on front of you and behind you, and sleeping with Uzis in your living room. I mean, you took incredible chances in Russia because you were trying to do the right thing and expose these thefts. It makes for incredible reading, and the courage that you had to have to try to expose this kind of corruption is amazing.
You know, if people say that it was courageous, but the way I viewed it, it was just sort of this marginal step down. I mean, it's sort of this day-by-day thing where it just got worse and worse and worse and worse, and I couldn't really sort of step away from it. And so, you know, we got into all these terrible fights with these bad people, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And, you know, to this day, people say, well, you know, what do you think about Russia? Should I get involved? And I say, no, it's just an absolute vortex of evil over there, and theft, evil, murder, and stealing.
Wow.
And it's just the worst possible thing you could ever imagine. And anyone who gets involved, you know, there's sort of only two basic outcomes. You can either end up like me. I was expelled from the country. They tried to steal all my stuff, and they ended up torturing and killing one of my associates. Or the alternative is that you can become sort of part of their criminal apparatus, in which case you're breaking all the laws in the U.S. and Europe, et cetera. And so just the best thing to do is just to stay as far away from that place as one possibly can. It's just terrible.
And so what does that bode for the future for Russia going forward under the Putin regime? That can never really become a modern country business-wise, can they, as long as there's a culture of corruption like that, top to bottom?
Well, I mean, in my own estimation, I think that Putin is one of the richest, if not the richest man in the world. And he got that way by being at the top of this mafia pyramid of stealing. Being president of Russia, the prime purpose of that is to steal money, and so he stole just billions and billions. I estimate in my own analysis that he's probably worth $200 billion.
$200 billion.
And the guys around him, you know, the 1,000 other people around him, probably, you know, if you add it all up, it's close to $1 trillion has been stolen by members of the Putin regime since they started 14 years ago. And I believe that as a result of that, the Russian people, if you're living in Russia, so you see these small group of people with yachts and villas and jets, and you're barely, you know, you go to the hospital and you can't even get medicine because you have to bribe the doctor to look after you, and your kids, there's no teachers at your kids' school, and the road is full of potholes because the money that was supposed to be spent was stolen, and the whole country doesn't work. And eventually people were saying to themselves, you know, this is not fun anymore. This is no good. We need to get rid of this guy. And they started marching in the streets about 2 years ago. And Putin got scared. And then he saw his neighbor, Viktor Yanukovych from Ukraine, the president of Ukraine, who was a junior varsity version of the crookedness that Putin has been running. And he saw Viktor Yanukovych getting kicked out, and you know, by hundreds of thousands, maybe close to 1 million people coming to Maidan Square in Kiev. And Putin thought to himself, "This is what's going to happen to me. They're going to have pitchforks in Red Square unless I do something dramatic about this." And so that's, I believe, why he starts this war in Ukraine. I don't think he cares about NATO or any of this other stuff. I don't think he doesn't think in the national interest anyways. I think he's done this to distract people away from his own corruption.
And it's actually increased his popularity. I think he goes and takes Crimea, and his popularity goes to, 80%, because people just think that he's looking out for old Mother Russia, and they seem to completely ignore what else is going on, don't they?
Well, I think it's a little complicated. First of all, it's even higher than what you said. It's 88% is his approval rating.
Oh, okay, 88%.
But we have to take that with a grain of salt, because so imagine you're living in a regime where if you oppose the president, the best thing that will happen to you is you lose your job, and the worst thing that happens to you is you get arrested and killed. And so when you have a stranger call you up from a polling agency and saying, "Do you support the president?"
Right.
What's your answer going to be? Of course you do. Yes, I support the president because nobody wants to. Why would you tell a stranger otherwise when such bad things happen to people who don't support the president? So, the 88% approval rating is definitely suspect. But I'm sure that you're right. That I'm sure that he is popular because what happens is the Russians they've bombarded the Putin regime has bombarded the Russian people with this propaganda and claiming that the Ukrainians are Nazi fascists. They use those words constantly on television, and those words have a great deal of resonance in Russia because they lost 20 million people in World War II against the Nazis and the fascists, and so
right.
that's something that's like embedded in their genes to be evil. And so Putin is telling everybody the Ukrainians are Nazis and fascists, and they're going to go and ethnically cleanse the good Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine, which is completely untrue. There's no Nazis, no fascists, and no ethnic cleansing going on, but they just run it 24 hours a day. And then Putin steps in and says, we're going to protect our brothers and sisters there and send our troops in. And, it's a compelling argument if it was true, but it's not. Nobody's doing any ethnic cleansing. They're not Nazis and fascists. And this was complete. It's like that movie Wag the Dog where they make up a fake war to get the president to be popular. This is just complete nonsense used to whip everybody up into a nationalist frenzy, and they're frothing at the mouth now in Russia about this complete fake thing that Putin's made up.
You have a history, don't you have a long history from Russia? Your grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party, was presidential candidate twice. And don't you have an actual connection, a heritage, an ancestral connection to Russia?
Yeah, so my grandfather, his name was Earl Browder, and he was from Wichita, Kansas. And he was a labor union organizer in the 1920s in Wichita, Kansas. And he was then invited by the Communist Party, called Comintern, the international wing of the Communist Party, to come to Russia in 1927. And so he goes to Russia, where he meets a young Russian girl who becomes my grandmother. My father and one of my uncles was born in Moscow. And then the whole family returns in 1932 to America, where my grandfather becomes the general secretary of the American Communist Party. And he ran for president twice, in 1936 and 1940, on the communist ticket against Roosevelt. He was then imprisoned by Roosevelt in 1941 and let out of jail a year later. Then he was expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being not communist enough and too capitalist. And then he was then persecuted during the McCarthy era in the 1950s for being a communist. So this was my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 50 years old now. And when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I said to myself, what's the best way to rebel from a family of communists? And I kind of looked around at all the options, and I came across the one that I thought was the best, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. There was nothing that would cause my family more grief than that. And so that's what I did.
And your story of capitalism is captivating, I should say. I mean, the story of how you get your seed money. I mean, you're just an ambitious guy, and it's just really an inspiring story. Beyond being of course, the tragedy of Magnitsky towards the end, but the story of how you became so successful is quite inspiring. You had a lot of initiative to do what you did, go into Russia when you did. It's really what inspired you to just go to Russia when here you were, Stanford MBA. You can tell from your book you love that California sunshine and all of that. You said it was like heaven when you walked onto the campus there in Palo Alto. And the next thing you know, you're reading about this guy, Bill Browder, who's in these cold, dark Moscow winters where the sun doesn't rise until 10 and sets at 3 in the afternoon. What in the world?
Well, I'll tell you, everyone sort of wants to make their mark somewhere in the world, and I was sitting at Stanford, and I'll tell you a little secret about business school, which is that the main purpose of business school is to figure out what you're going to do after business school. And so most MBA students at Stanford and Harvard and all these other places are all just sort of going and trying to search their souls for what their career should look like. And I was at Stanford, and I was going to all these company presentations and banks and all these different organizations that were on campus looking to hire people, and none of the stuff that most people were interested in, and none of the stuff that was normally available was it didn't really resonate with me for some reason, and I was trying to figure out what to do, and I was graduating from business school in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down, and
your timing was perfect.
So there I was, trying to, searching my soul, trying to figure out what to do. The Berlin Wall has just come down, and then I had this epiphany, which was, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to go become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe.
Wow.
That's what I said to myself, and I set out to do that, and I didn't know whether I'd succeed or not. But the interesting thing was that I was entering Eastern Europe when nobody wanted to go there. Nobody. There was not a single person that had any interest in going to do business in Eastern Europe other than me. And there's an expression, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I'm not even sure I had one eye in that world, but I had more. I was just by being interested, I had an advantage over everybody else who wasn't interested. And the great thing about Eastern Europe and about Russia was that nobody had any more experience than I did about doing business there, because nobody had done any business, and so it was completely a clean slate. You could be a, sort of late 20s, early 30s person and be right at the top of the game, because there wasn't some guy who was 45 or 50 who had 20 years on me. I was right there learning about it for the first time as anyone, and nobody else was even learning about it for the first time. And so that's what sort of was my advantage when I was first starting out. And of course, I worked hard. I worked every day. I didn't take, while everybody else was out drinking beers, I was, with my nose to the grindstone. But by being first in and being interested when nobody else was a huge advantage.
You tell stories of going up and looking at trawler fleets on these freezing cold, up near the Arctic Circle, and finding these Russian companies that had just gone private or were just in the process of going private, and you just did a quick back of the envelope analysis. Let's see, what's the value of this trawler here? How many trawlers do you have? What's the value of the company? And you would do a double take and go, wait a minute, no, the value of the company is less than the sum value of all the trawlers. And you did the same thing with Russian oil companies and all of this sort of stuff. And you just made billions of dollars for your investors. And you gave all that up to become a human rights activist now. How does that career change affect you today?
Well, so on November 16th, 2009, my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in a Russian prison after being taken hostage by a bunch of corrupt police officers and other officials because he exposed their corruption. And that I got the news on the 17th of November 2009, one day in the morning after he was murdered. And it was the most painful news I've ever gotten in my life. It was like a knife going right into my heart. And I can't even describe how terrible it is to have a young man, he was 37 years old, he had a wife and 2 children, he was a lovely man, a really good person, having him murdered because he was my lawyer. And for me, that the responsibility.
Did you know Sergei well before that happened? I know he was your lawyer, but I didn't. I thought that this was a situation where you knew him more professionally. But then when all of this happened and you were in London and you were powerless to do anything about it, and you knew that they were really after you and they wanted him to implicate you, and you felt such a connection to him because they were wanting him to basically make a confession that he did it and to implicate you in it, and you felt that he was not only fighting for his own honor but fighting for yours as well, and there you were in London powerless to help him. And is that you didn't know him as well, but you felt such a bond to, I think, I get this feeling that you became one with him almost from a distance. Yeah,
well, he was one of many lawyers that worked for me and my firm, and I knew him, and we had a number of interactions, but he wasn't a close friend or anything, but he was an incredibly earnest young man who tried his best for me, and when he got put into a terrible situation where basically he could have perjured himself and borne false witness against me in order to improve his situation. He refused to do out of his own personal integrity. For him, the idea of breaking the ninth commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," was he just did not want to do that. And for that he gave his life, and for every day for the rest of my life, I cannot forget that, and it's my duty to him, his memory, and his family,
and had
to
he
make sure
and had
that
he
people face justice.
And had he turned on you, those red notices might not have been. They might have been honored by Interpol and by these governments, because the name of the book. I'm here with Bill Browder. If you've just joined us, and I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. And Mr. Browder is joining us from London, and he's the author of Red Notice. It's a true story of his fight for justice for his friend and lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered by the Russian government. And Mr. Browder was instrumental in getting the Magnitsky law passed in 2012. That's a fascinating the way you got that done. Did it help that you were a big time capitalist when you were trying to get this done on Capitol Hill? I mean, you could certainly get the doors open to you because you were someone that had some money and some influence in financial circles. But the senators certainly welcomed you, didn't they?
I would say it actually worked against me to be a big-time capitalist. Nobody in Washington, it's people don't really like capitalists that much. I mean, I think that the reason why the Magnitsky law was passed, the reason why people gave me an audience, was because of Sergei's story. I wasn't there asking for any favors for myself. I've never made a campaign donation in my life to any party. The reason why this worked was because his story was almost biblical in its good versus evil. That Sergei was good and these people were evil, and you can't hear his story without having a strong emotional reaction. And no matter what people say about politicians in Washington, and they have to make a lot of compromises. They all went there originally to do public service and to do exactly the kind of thing which the Magnitsky law was, which was the Magnitsky story and the Magnitsky law was what everybody went to become public servants for. And so there I was with this story, which is just truly biblical in its nature, and that's what got people in Washington unified. And the vote, 92-4 in the Senate, nobody agrees on anything in Washington like that. This is the one thing that everyone could agree on, which is that we shouldn't allow Russian torturers and murderers come to America. And
Putin violated one of his rules, didn't he? Because he mentioned you by name. This Magnitsky law upset him. And right after that was when he announced that Americans would no longer be able to go to Russia and adopt Russian children. And then he went on television and announced this, and he actually mentioned Bill Browder by name, and you said he never mentions his enemies by name. So I guess that's an interesting story.
Yeah, but Putin is a typical mafia guy, and the mafia guys, it's interesting to watch him. The mafia guys, they don't ever want to acknowledge their enemies by name because that humanizes them. They want to make them into just effectively sort of murder targets that nobody has to think about. And for this whole story has been unfolding for years. And when people would ask Putin about me, and they've asked him, journalists would ask him on a number of occasions, he'd either say, "I don't know who that man is," or "that man." He never would ever mention the name. He'd say, "that man." And then all of a sudden, after the Magnitsky Act was passed, he was so upset, and there was a press conference taking place. It was around the end of December, and there was a big press conference. He runs these sort of 4-hour annual press conferences and he fills up an auditorium with like 500 journalists, international and domestic.
Does he take his shirt off? Does he take his shirt off for these? I'm joking.
Not at the press conference, but he sits there for 4.5 hours and answers questions. And it's normally everyone's very self-censoring and nice and polite to him. And these journalists started asking him about Magnitsky and about the adoptions, the banning of American adoptions of Russian disabled orphans. And one after another, there were something like 6 or 7 of these questions, and he started just getting more and more agitated. And he eventually just blew his lid, and he said that Sergei Magnitsky died of natural causes. He wasn't murdered. He didn't uncover any crimes, and he wasn't a human rights lawyer. He worked for this man, Bill Browder, who's wanted by our authorities for criminal charges. that's when we knew we got under his skin then, and unfortunately when Vladimir Putin mentions your name in that context, nothing good's going to happen after that, and that's when the whole trial against Sergei after they killed him and the trial against me in absentia was launched.
Wow. How do we deal with a country like Russia going forward, Bill? They are very powerful, even though they're thugs. They've got a lot of nuclear weapons. They got a big army. They got a lot of money with the oil. They're very dangerous. A wounded bear can just cause all kinds of problems. How does Obama came and did what they call the reset. We have to have relations with this country because they're so powerful. What do you do going forward dealing with a country like Russia? Because if you prick them too hard, can't they just cause a lot of damage in this world?
They can. But let me start by saying what you don't do with a country like Russia, and that is you don't try to appease Vladimir Putin. Appeasing dictators is a formula which has been tried and doesn't work. And remember, there's a very famous incident in World War II where Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, tried to appease Hitler, and he came back with a piece of paper saying, "I've negotiated peace in our time," and of course we know what happened after that. Vladimir Putin is a man who doesn't understand anything other than physical constraints, and so what you don't do is you don't try to appease him, and what you do is you contain him. We need to effectively run a strategy of containment where there's huge consequences for him doing anything bad that he's trying to do, because he's in Ukraine right now, but this is not the end of his story. He's going to be messing around in all neighboring countries, and including the Baltics, which are very significant because those are NATO countries where we have a treaty obligation to defend them.
Right. And what is to stop him? Isn't that kind of one of his? It seems to me that that's a possibility that's where he's going to start meddling next and try to just kind of poke NATO and start trying to get some of these countries to say on their own that they want to join. What do you envision him trying to do in Latvia and those other NATO countries, the Baltics?
Well, I think he's going to organize what I call a plausibly deniable invasion, like he did in Crimea. Remember, they claimed that there weren't Russian troops in Crimea. Mm-hmm. They'll organize some type of provocation, meaning that some incident will happen in one of those countries against Russian-speaking minorities, and at that point, then he'll send in provocateurs and saboteurs and mercenaries who will then start committing crimes and creating a situation where they can enrage the local Russian population and the local Estonian or Latvian or Lithuanian population against them, and then they'll create their own little sort of mini conflict, and we're all going to be sitting, at a great distance, saying, well, have they invaded or have they not invaded? And then we don't even know if they have, and if they have, should we then respect this Article 5 of the NATO treaty and defend them, or should we not? And Obama is going to say, well, should we go to war with Russia over a country that no one's ever heard of? And if Putin is right about this, and he might very well be, it may be that we never do anything with this Article 5 of NATO. We don't actually honor this treaty obligation. And if that happens, then the whole concept of NATO falls apart, and then Putin can do whatever he wants, wherever he wants in his neighborhood. And then we end up, in a situation will eventually, metastasize into some type of really ugly European war.
It's scary, isn't it? What is conceivable, really actually conceivable, based upon what's happened in Crimea, what's happening right now in Ukraine, and we can all envision what's going to happen. And what is NATO going to do with Article 5? I mean, if he does it in such a way that it's not conclusive as to what's going on, it's kind of a recipe for World War III. I mean, I know it's kind of crazy to think that something like that could happen, but it's right there in front of us.
And he has every intention of doing it. And those of us who have been, engaged with this man, he is an evil man, and he lies, and he uses force, and he murders, and he covers up. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it with Sergei Magnitsky. We're seeing it now with Boris Nemtsov, the opposition leader who was murdered. And this is a very, very scary situation. He's a very, very dangerous man. And if we're lucky, we'll end up in a Cold War situation with him, not a hot war.
Who killed Boris Nemtsov?
Well, in my opinion, the order could have only come from one place, which is in that top seat in the president's chair in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin. I think that Boris Nemtsov posed a real political problem for Putin. There is an economic crisis which is happening right now in Russia. With an economic crisis, people become more politically agitated because they want the government to fix their problems, and the government doesn't have enough money to do that. And so I think that there was two objectives with this assassination. One was to take out a very important opposition leader who was trying to rally people to call for the president's dismissal. And the second was to terrorize, in an act of political terror, everybody else who is considered to be an opposition politician, to say, look, we can take the most high-profile opposition politician in the country, Boris Nemtsov, former deputy prime minister of the country, and we can kill him in the most secure spot in the country and possibly in the world, right in front of the Kremlin, where there's a security camera at every place. And we can kill him with impunity. That's the message. And,
wow.
And I believe that Putin was the one behind it.
We only have about a minute left before we're going to go to a break. I would like to ask you one more quick question, if you can answer it. Why did he let you go? Why were you they let you go and go back? You were there in that detention for 24 hours, and they let you go. Why do you think that you were allowed to go home when he could have imprisoned you like he does so many of his other enemies?
Well, I think at that time he wasn't as brazen as he is now. They could have killed me, and that would have set off a chain reaction of God knows what, and they were afraid of that. They could have put me in prison, but that would have made them as much of a hostage to my prison situation as I would have been, in the sense that every world leader would have to spend the first 5 minutes of their meeting talking about Bill Browder being in prison. And so at the time, when they were less brazen than they are right now, they thought the best way to get rid of me was to deport me and declare me a threat to national security, and send a message to anyone else that if you're a foreigner doing bad stuff here, we're going to kick you out and try to take all your stuff. It was lucky for me. It wasn't so lucky for Sergei Magnitsky, my brave and honorable lawyer, who tried to defend me and ended up getting arrested, tortured, and killed in Russia. And for that, I'll never forget, the horror of what that country was all about.
Well, your book definitely, you're a great force for justice in the world, and I'm really grateful for you to join us on our show today, Bill Browder. Thank you so much for coming on. You're the author of Red Notice, and really the story of your fight for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. It's quite a story. Thank you so much for coming on our show today.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right, you too. And that's we're gonna go to a little CBS news break here and then we'll be right back with another hour of Justice for All. I'm George Yates. If you've just joined us, this is Justice for All, and we've just been with Bill Browder, the author of Red Notice.